Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and it's October, which means it's time to make some Pokemon. And being a sucker for all things Gen 1, I'm gonna make Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. But I'm gonna make them fight for your affection. Of course, before they fight, they need to be birthed into this world via clumps of overly colorful clay, the first of which will be this orange, which I'm gonna tone down by combining it with a little gray. Once I've got a much mellower, slightly desaturated, fire-breathing dinosaur flesh tone, I can fill it with a little aluminium skeleton to begin the birthing process for what will become my Charmander, who, henceforth, shall be called Gary. Once Gary's got a tear-shaped midsection, I can attach a little tail onto the bottom, blend it in, and make sure it's nice and girthy. Then it's just a case of giving the tip a little tickle, and I can drop it to lock it. Some more foil scrunched into a ball will be Gary's skull that, once wrapped in a layer of color-appropriate clay, can get smooshed in place on the top part of the torso, which, for those who aren't sure, is opposite the tail. I'll then build out Gary's jowls and turn his forehead into a 5-head before cutting a little line into his beak to make his mouth. I'll open this up until he's extra yelly, since the plan is to have Gary breathing fire down on his opponents. Once I've smoothed out his 5-head and hidden any of the sharper seams, I can use the flat of my sculpting spatula to mark out Gary's eyes. A couple holes in the front of his face will allow for oxygen intake, and a thin sheet of pinkish clay will work as the inside of his mouth. This is mostly to prevent having to paint it later. I'll then add a tongue of slightly lighter clay, then jam a set of pre-baked translucent teeth into his gums. I can add some slightly tapered orange-colored sausages where his legs would be, which, once I angle them and blend them into the body and add a pair of little feet, will actually become said legs. Then I can blend and smooth the surface to remove the joining seams before poking some teeny tiny divots into the tips of his feet so I can jam some more pre-baked teeth into his toes, which will then make them claws and complete the feet. Now, the astute among you may notice that Gary is missing his Second Amendment rights, but before I get to arming this little fire lizard, I want to give his body a couple coats of paint to give his coloring a bit of depth. I'm going to be wrapping Gary in green vines, so I'll paint his body before I do that so I don't have to worry about working around them later. Otherwise, once Gary's got his traditional orangey top coat with a barely yellow belly, I can set him aside and get to work making some vines. The vines will be holding Gary aloft, so I need to make sure they've got a nice strong core. To that end, I'll make them by cutting a couple lengths of equally sized wire and coating them in a viney green clay. Once I've got some lovely little vines, I can wrap them around Gary's body until he's adequately entangled. Then I'll bake it all in the oven before getting to work making his itty-bitty arms. These start out as little balls of clay that get rolled into little tapered leg-like sausages, except instead of tooth-toed feet, I'll make little hands by pinching and pulling the tip until I've got 3 fingers and a thumb. I can then attach these arms to the sides of his body, blend them in, then bake them and paint them until they match the rest of Gary's coloring. Otherwise, once Gary's been armed, it's time to set him aside and get to work making Bulbasaur, or as we're on a first-name basis, let's get to work making Gale. Gale starts out much like Gary, but instead of an orange-wrapped aluminium body, hers is greenish-blue. Also, instead of a tail, Gale doesn't have anything, just butt cheeks, I guess. So instead, we'll go straight to her head. This starts out as a slightly too small ball that I can build up until it's roughly 2/3 the size of her torso. Then I can carve a little mouth into it and make her look extra angry. I figured if these three are fighting each other, then there's probably a fair amount of anger in the mix. Except Gary, of course, since he's just happy to see the world on fire. Once Gale's got a grimace, I can pop her eyes in place in a similar manner to how I made Gary's, only with a slightly more furrowed brow to help sell the pure rage she's feeling. Then a couple little flared sniffing holes, and I can add her ear cones and begin the enwrinkling of her neck before baking her body and adding a bunch of legs. Well, 4 legs to be precise, which will each get a set of 3 toe holes filled with more of those pre-baked toe teeth. With my body baked again, I can start to add a bit of extra coloring in much the same manner as Gary, but again with more of the Gale-appropriate bluish green. With that finished, I can then move on to making Gale's garlic bulb backpack, which starts out as a little blob of green clay wrapped around a little bulb-shaped aluminium ball. A little poking and prodding with a ball stylus and some cutting with a blade will get me a bulb-shaped backpack that I can then open up to reveal the beautiful flowering garlic bulb inside. This can then get stuck onto Gale's back, and using Gale's body as a handle, I can start to smooth out the bulb and add some final surface details until I've got a nice textured bulbasaur back bulb, at which point I can bake it in the oven before figuring out how to attach Gary and his vines. What I found was that I shouldn't have double wrapped Gary, so I peeled his vines off his body and made some new vines, except this time I'm gonna go a little easier with the wrapping since last time I didn't leave myself enough vine length to attach it neatly to Gale's body. I also don't want both of Gale's vines wrapped around Gary. This way I can have one vine holding Gary and the other vine lashing out at the third and final combatant. Otherwise, the last thing I need to do is add the little flowery bit at the tips of the veins, and that's Gale finished, which means it's time to get to work on that aforementioned third combatant, Squirtle, who, in keeping with our Gen 1 G names, shall be named Jeff, but like, spelled funny. I'll start Jeff off with a not fully wrapped brownish beige belly into which I can carve the Squirtle-esque turtle shell tummy, then wrap the back in a much browner blob that will get carved into a turtle shell shaped shape, complete with the important turtle hexagons and spirally textures. Before adding the blue of Jeff's body, I'll give his belly a beigey sponge bath before giving his shell the same but in varying shades of brown. Finally, I'll wrap the connecting seam in a long white wormy dealing. Jeff's head follows the Gen 1 Sculpting School of Design, which calls for a little ball of aluminium wrapped in color-appropriate clay, then jammed onto a pre-baked body. The big difference here is that Jeff's going to get a little dot for a mouth since, much like Gary, he's going to be blasting away with his signature attack. However, unlike Gary's fire, Jeff's going to be blasting water out his boosh, so he needs to have his cheeks puffed up in preparation. Otherwise, once his eyes are in place and breathing holes have been added, I can make sure he's aping Gale's angry eyebrows, then it's on to making his arms. These are functionally identical to Gary's arms, except they're blue and they only have 3 fingers. His arms can get attached where you'd attach arms, then I'll make 2 more arms that are slightly thicker and attach them to the bottom of the body where they'll then become legs. I'm also envisioning Jeff doing an awesome dodge out of the way of Gary's fire blast, so I'll drill a hole into his left arm and into his body and add a length of wire so that I can support his weight on his arm. All that's left to do then is make Jeff's tail, which starts out as a little ball that gets rolled into a tapered tube and squished until it's kind of like a little blue apostrophe. I'll then carve the swirly detail into the bottom, and I can stick it into Jeff's butt. And with that, it's into the oven to bake, and that's Jeff finally finished, which means all 3 starters are mostly finished. All they need now are some final details painted on. I'll start by painting the vines with a unifying green to hide the different colors of the clay I used, then I can paint Gary's eyeballs white. Once the white is dried, I can get to work adding the overly detailed details to his eyes. It's amazing how much of a difference the eyeball details make to Pokemon, but after having made more than a few pocket monsters in my day, I've realized it pays to take the time to get them right. Gary's the only one that's got a happy expression, so I'll paint on his eyebrows, then give his teeth and toenails a simple white once-over before finishing him off by adding some light green dry brushing to his vines. On to Gale, I'll give her bulb a dark green base coat, and while I wait for that to dry, I can paint her eyes and teeth white before taping off the blue of her body so I can get her garlic bulb backpack some shading via aggressive sponging of lighter greens. Then it's on to adding her dark green reverse vitiligo and finally giving her a pair of big angry red eyes. A little black eyeshadow will make her look even more angry, and a little white around the nails will finish her off. Now I've taped off Jeff's body so I can give him the old 1-2 light blue with a sponge before spending significantly longer making sure his eyes are appropriately squirtly. It's particularly important for him since I didn't have anything else to paint on his body, but I want to make sure he gets just as much screen time. Of course, he also gets some angry eyeshadow to round it all out. Last but not least, each of my starters will get the ever-important UV resin over the eyeballs to make them look nice and wet. Squirtle. Finally, a couple dabs of CA glue and some elbow grease will help keep Gary and the vines in place, and I can get to work making the base. Now, when you first choose your starters, you're in Professor Oak's lab, so I thought maybe a simple tiled lab floor would work best. To make a tiled floor, I'll cut out a little sheet of XPS foam, then mark out a set of equally sized tiles. Once I've got my tiles marked out, I'll prime and protect the foam with a coat of Mod Podge and paint. I'll then follow this with a couple coats of high gloss white, followed by a final gray wash to add some shading. And as simple as that, I've got a lovely little white tiled lab floor already ready for Gail, who I've added pins to her back feet to keep the weight of Gary from toppling her forward. Now, as I mentioned, Gary's going to be blasting forth a gout of fire, which means I need to make some fire. Now, I think I've made fire out of every conceivable material, so today I figured I'd give hot glue and an acrylic rod a go round and see how that works. Once I've built up an initial layer of goopy hot glue, I'll add some little strips of clear packaging plastic that I cut into shapes that vaguely resemble flames. I'll then cover these in plenty of hot goopy glue as well until I've got a lavy looking not quite clear gout of fire. Finally, to remove the little stringy bits left over from the glue gun, I'll blast it with a little actual fire. To color my flames, I'll start by adding some bright red ink to build up the base colors before realizing I should have gone with yellow, at which point I'll try desperately to remove the red ink with alcohol and a brush before giving up and just going over the whole thing with yellow anyways. The inks are transparent enough to keep the translucency of the glue beneath, but are pigmented enough to add plenty of color. Now, I don't know if any of that makes sense or if it's even true, but it sounds good and it makes me seem like I have any idea of what I'm doing. Otherwise, once I've got the yellow base coat built up, I'll go back to my red to tickle the tips of the flames and add some of that lovely contrast. Regardless of intention or not though, look at how good this fire looks. I think this might be the best little gout of flame I've ever made. Now I'm going to attach this to the floor so it's not quite in Gary's mouth, but before I attach it, I want to try my hand at some object source lighting. I'll start by spraying yellow around the center of the floor above the flame, then work my way out with reds, adding a bit of red around Gail's face and eyes as well. The goal here is to make it look like the fire is giving off light. Once I'm happy enough with my first attempt at OSL, I can glue the glue to the floor, and with that in place, I can figure out where Jeff is going to be dodging away from. He will of course be firing off his own elemental blast, which, much like Gary's fire breath, starts out as a clear acrylic rod. A quick dry fit in Jeff's mouth will make sure he's got the right angle, since I want the water blast to be shooting over Gail's back and between the vines. I can then pop it out and get to work making my water. This time, instead of hot glue though, I'm going to use some clear silicone caulking. I use this stuff for water all the time, and it's truly become one of my favorite materials. It's super sticky and adheres to anything, but you can manipulate it easily enough with the assistance of a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. I usually leave a little bottle on hand so I can either spray the silicone or dip my fingers as I work it into the shape I want. While it's saggy at first, once it starts to set, I can begin to twist it around the rod until I've got a pretty sweet looking little watery cyclone. After a few hours, it's pretty much cured, and I'm once again psyched by just how awesome this stuff is. Of course, if you want, you can add a little bit of cotton wrapped around the cyclone to add some watery splashes, but you can't really undo it since it'll stick to the silicone. In the end, I chickened out and decided I was happy with how it was, so all I need to do then is stick it into Jeff's mouth, and that's us done here and on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a massive thank you to my lovely patrons who continue to support this channel despite the weekly Russian roulette of will the sculpture be horrifying or delightful. And a special hey how are you to those newcomers who chose to spin the chamber this week: Adrena, Pudding Panda, Sarah Adrian, Mr. Scum, The Real Infidel, Blood and Coffee, Breen Dan, CJ122, Zacharoni and Cheeseballs, Death God, Built by D, Riley Price, Keegan and Grayson Small, Tatsuta Hime, Happy Birthday King, Bria Loves Wormy Dealies, Stephen Calvert, Meg Han Solo Cup, Tori Orr, Johannes, Nexus, Lieber Schnitzel, Skylar Lackner, Ethan, Madsdole Olavsbraten, Fawn Hutchinson, Alex, Ven, and Happy Birthday Cole Squid. You are the little hidden acrylic rod that keeps this wet, flammable channel aloft. If you like this video, then good news, Poketober continues, and if you didn't like this video, then make sure you share it with everyone you know so they can see how awful it is as well. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.